New York Police Detective Ralph Salerno once said, "Of all the criminals I've seen in person, only two have ever scared me: Carmine Galante and Aniello Dellacroce. They had a terrifying look in their eyes, the eyes of a real killer." While the name Aniello Dellacroce, underboss of the Gambino family and mentor to John Gotti, is well known to anyone interested in the history of organized crime, Carmine Galante remains largely a mystery. Doctors considered him an unstable psychopath, and his enemies would cross the street when they saw him coming. He began his criminal career when fedora hats were in fashion, and men like Lucky Luciano and Salvatore Maranzano were still alive, and ended it in the years when the word omertà had become meaningless. He broke the rules and never parted with his cigar. Meet Carmine Lilo Galante on the other side of the law. Before you continue watching, I'd like to ask for your financial support of the channel. At the link in the description, you can find my store-branded merch with exclusive prints designed by me. If you have the opportunity and you like something, please buy it so you can help the channel to develop. Thank you in advance and enjoy your viewing. Carmine Galante was born on February 21, 1910, in New York City. When registering the newborn, the official made a mistake, writing his name as Camillo instead of Carmine. But the Galante family hardly cared about such a trifle. Carmine Galante's father, Vincenzo Galante, was born in Castellammare del Golfo in Sicily and moved to the United States with his wife in 1906. Carmine had two brothers, Samuel, the eldest, and Peter, the youngest, as well as two sisters. The family settled in Williamsburg, in the northern part of Brooklyn. As a child, Carmine was a very restless boy, so restless that in 1921, he was briefly hospitalized with a head injury sustained in a road accident. He was hit by a car while walking. Years later, some experts even wondered if this injury had caused some psychopathic traits in Carmine. He wasn't a great student. He went to a regular school for a while, then he got transferred to a reform school. After that, Carmine went to a vocational school in Queens, but only until 7th grade. At the age of 14, he was arrested for the first time for shoplifting, and at 15, Carmine decided that he had had enough education and began spending all of his time in the streets of Little Italy with his close friend Joseph di Palermo, nicknamed Joe Beck, who would later also become part of the mafia. Joseph's younger brother Peter, Pete Beck di Palermo, was also a member of the Galante gang from the very beginning. Carmine's cousin Angelo Little Mo Provenzano was always by his side and would accompany him almost until the end of his life. At the same time, Galante began carrying out orders for more senior criminals. It turned out that Galante's strong point was beating people up. After that, he would often pick their pockets. Some of Galante's associates left their victims money for transportation so they could get home, but Carmine was not so generous. On December 12, 1925, Galante found himself in the city jail for the first time. 6 months later, he moved into a new league and ended up in state prison. He was found guilty of armed robbery and sentenced to 2 to 5 years. Carmine served almost 4 years of this sentence in Sing Sing prison before being released on parole in 1930. It's worth noting that Carmine had been arrested several times in his youth, but each time the charges were dismissed. Potential jurors and witnesses understood that it was not worth crossing this man. By the age of 20, Carmine Galante was rightly considered one of the most notorious thugs around. Once free, Galante set about making up for lost time. Just a few months after his release from prison, on March 15, 1930, Carmine committed his first murder, shooting police officer Walter de Castilla. This was no ordinary cop killing, committed during a robbery or a chase, for example. No, this was revenge, because less than a year earlier, in the summer of 1929, while Carmine was still locked up, de Castilla and his partner arrested several robbers who ended up in prison. Apparently, that arrest caused someone in the criminal world to hold a grudge. On that fateful day, de Castilla was acting as a cash collector guarding the delivery of wages to the warehouse of Martin Weinstein Shoe Company. Just as de Castilla handed the money to the manager and he opened the safe, several armed men entered the office. De Castilla was killed on the spot, and the criminals, without touching the money or harming anyone else, immediately left the building. The murder of the police officer made headlines in all New York newspapers. The entire city police force gathered to see de Castilla off on his final journey. But despite the fact that the whole city guessed who the officer's killer was, no one came forward to testify against Galante. All the witnesses preferred to forget what they had seen, and the news of the cop's murder came as no surprise to anyone. De Castella was the 7th of 19 New York police officers killed in the line of duty in 1930. In August, Galante was brought to trial but was acquitted due to lack of evidence. De Castella's murder became the oldest unsolved police murder in New York City history. Then, from 1930 to 1935, Galante claimed to have worked as a sorter at the O'Brien Fish Company. The company was legitimate, but had ties to organized crime. During Prohibition, the company's building housed a cafe, which was actually an underground speakeasy. Of course, this job was nothing more than a front. Galante's real occupation was robbery and bootlegging. He invested part of his earnings at the time in an underground distillery on Long Island. Just a few weeks after De Castella's murder, on May 6, 1930, Galante was involved in another high-profile crime. That day, he and 4 accomplices raided an insurance company office in Brooklyn, stealing $1,200. In addition to cash, the robbers also took earrings, bracelets, and rings from the terrified employees. Given that Galante robbed or beat someone almost every week, no one was particularly surprised when he was arrested in August 1930 for armed robbery of a restaurant. He had to spend several months in prison, but then a stroke of luck intervened. He attracted the attention of very expensive lawyers, whose services were probably paid for by those who had ordered De Castella's murder as a token of gratitude, and Carmine was released. As for the insurance robbery, Galante got away with that too. He only spent a couple of months in prison and he was released. On Christmas Eve 1930, Carmine and 4 accomplices robbed the Liebman Brewery in Brooklyn. The robbers made off with $4,000, which was a very good haul for those times, but greed got in the way and the robbery did not go according to plan. Instead of fleeing, the men broke into a truck parked near the brewery to steal some free beer. It turned out that a detective named Joseph Menahan, who happened to be in the area, had been watching the robbers the whole time. He decided that he was dealing with ordinary thieves and followed their car. After stealing several cases of beer and loading them into their green sedan, the 4 finally drove away from the brewery, but got stuck in traffic not far from it. Menahan, who had by then reached the car, asked the 4 what they were doing near the brewery, then blew his police whistle to call for backup. The robbers tried to run away. Menahan decided to stop them and fired a warning shot into the air. Galante started firing back and a shootout broke loose. The detective was hit by 5 bullets, but he was incredibly lucky. 4 bullets got stuck in his coat and only 1 hit his thigh. However, one of the bullets fired by Galante wounded a 6-year-old girl. It's unknown whether it was a coincidence or whether Menahan's whistle actually attracted attention, but at that moment, a police officer was driving by and saw Menahan chasing the armed men. He slowed down and the wounded Menahan jumped into his car. By that time, Galante's 3 accomplices had already managed to escape, and Galante was lying wounded on the road. He was immediately taken to the police station and interrogated. Carmine tried to deceive the law enforcement and gave them the name of his cousin, Charles Bruno, but one of the police officers present knew Galante personally and was able to expose his lie. Galante was then examined by psychiatrists. One of them described him as intellectually and emotionally dull, indifferent to everything. His mental age was 14 and a half and his IQ was only 90. Carmine was shy with strangers, uninterested in news from outside the prison, and couldn't even name any holidays. According to doctors, Galante was a neurotic with psychopathic traits. However, some believe that he was very skilled at faking his symptoms. In any case, on January 8, 1931, Carmine pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Despite the fact that he had to spend a lot of time behind bars, he could feel like a winner. Firstly, Carmine had proven himself to be a man with enormous balls, who did not betray any of his comrades, and secondly, although he did not realize it at the time, his long prison sentence saved him from participating in the Castellamarese War, which you can see more about in our video on the birth of the New York Mafia. It's quite possible that Galante would not have survived. He began serving a sentence in Dannemora prison. In 1932, Galante was transferred from Dannemora to the Great Meadow Correctional Facility. This was good news for him, as his cousin and best friend, Little Mo, was serving time there as well. Together, they caused the prison administration a lot of trouble. For example, they once staged a knife fight that resulted in the death of one inmate. This happened on the morning of January 26, 1933, when Galante, Little Mo, and their friend on the inside, Salvatore Agro, were about to leave the prison yard to go to work. On the way, they were attacked by 3 men, one of whom was 28-year-old Joseph Delgaius, who was serving a sentence for first-degree manslaughter in Brooklyn. Afterwards, all those involved in the fight tried to pass it off as a spontaneous altercation, with Galante claiming that he and his friends and the man who was killed were victims of the same thugs. Firstly, the fight took place when there were no security guards around, and secondly, while Galante and Agro, who were defending themselves in the fight, got away with minor cuts, Delgaius was killed. At this point, I would like to make one reservation. Carmine Galante was not some idiot who did not understand a simple thing. If he killed a prisoner, he would never get out of prison on parole. And what's more, his sentence would only be extended. In our opinion, given that Delgaius had previously committed crime in Brooklyn, it's possible that the situation with Officer De Castella was repeated, the settling of some old scores, a murder on someone else's orders. In addition, Great Meadow Prison was notorious for its rather peculiar management. At that time, its director was Joseph H. Wilson, whose name became famous throughout the country after he allowed his friend's plane to land in the prison yard when he flew in for lunch. Joseph Wilson's friend was Vanny Higgins, one of the most notorious gangsters and bootleggers of the time. The incident received such publicity that Wilson was even criticized by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In response, Wilson rather bluntly stated that he lived in a free country and would dine with whomever he wanted. As a result of the fighting incident, Galante's sentence was extended by 3 years. However, the incident did not prevent Carmine from being released on parole in May 1939. He served only 8 years of his 12-year sentence. It's noteworthy that Galante became the last prisoner in New York State history to be released early without appearing before a special parole board. Shortly after Galante left prison, a law passed to prevent this from happening again. Upon his release, Carmine found legal employment. He changed jobs quite a few times, but they all had one thing in common. Galante never showed up. Sometimes it even got to the point of absurdity. For example, in 1942, he allegedly worked for Knickerbocker Trucking Company as a supposed transportation assistant. Everything would have been fine, except that the company had only one truck. The situation was much the same with his other official jobs. But what really brought Carmine a good income was murder and bootlegging, because even though Prohibition was repealed in 1932, for a long time afterward, the price of legal alcohol was so high that many people couldn't afford it. With the money he earned, Galante bought shares in entertainment venues and nightclubs. One such purchase was the Bonfire restaurant in Montreal. This establishment did not belong entirely to Carmine. His partners were Harry Shipp and Luigi Louis Greco. These characters are worth dwelling on in more detail. Harry Shipp controlled Montreal's major gambling establishments in the 1940s and was a true genius with numbers. He was very well educated and even studied at Queen's University for a time, but did not graduate. However, he had a weakness. He became addicted to gambling and betting, which led him into debt. It was apparently his gambling addiction and need for money that led him to choose someone like Galante as a business partner. Galante's other partner at the Bonfire, Louis Greco, was the head of the Montreal Mafia from the mid-1940s to the early 70s. He would later become one of the key figures in the French Dispatch drug ring. As for the restaurant itself, it looked like a legitimate and even respectable establishment, but as the future would show, it was only a front for shady dealings, among which heroin distribution would stand out. In 1943, Carmine Galante committed a crime that went down in history. He was ordered to kill 63-year-old Carlo Tresca, an Italian immigrant and ardent anti-fascist who had become one of the most famous political activists in the United States. Tresca participated in strikes and often criticized everyone he could in the press, bankers and priests to politicians and officials. Some sources call Tresca a communist, but this is not entirely true. For example, in his articles, he criticized Stalin with the same vehemence as he did the fascists. It can be said that he was a personal enemy of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. It's believed that the murder of Tresca was ordered by Vito Genovese, who was in Italy at the time, as he had been wanted for murder in the US since 1937. Genovese did not arrive in Italy empty-handed. He had about $750 grand with him, which he generously distributed to the fascist leadership. while also conducting business and making useful acquaintances. Genovese became close to the Italian fascists and, wanting to please Mussolini, decided to get rid of his enemy. However, there's also a version according to which Mussolini and Genovese had nothing to do with it. Tresca decided to eliminate Frank Garofalo, who was in business with local fascist Generoso Pope, becoming known to Tresca when he wrote an article about it. Garofalo was acquainted with Galante. They were both involved in bootlegging and had mutual acquaintances, among whom, of course, Joseph Barbara stood out. Barbara was the owner of the Appalachian Estate, where the infamous Mafia Conference took place in 1957. On the evening of January 11, 1943, Tresca was shot dead in downtown New York as he was leaving a restaurant with a friend. He was hit by 2 bullets, after which the shooters quickly got into a car and drove away from the scene of the crime. The car was soon found by police 3 blocks away. Galante became one of the suspects in the murder because, on that day, shortly before the crime, Carmine had visited his parole officer. One of the patrol officers followed Galante after he left the building where he had been talking to the officer. It turned out that Galante got into his car with the same license plate number as the one that was found abandoned soon after Tresca's murder. The authorities understood that it was the same car, but it was impossible to prove that it was the only one used by Tresca's killers. The law enforcement officers summoned Carmine for questioning, which lasted all night. But, as expected, they were unable to obtain any information from him. A confrontation between Galante and a witness to the murder, Tresca's friend Giuseppe Calabi, also ended in nothing. He did not identify Galante as the killer, explaining that he had turned away at the moment the shots were fired. In the end, the most the police could do was find Galante guilty of violating the terms of his parole and send him back to prison to serve the remainder of his sentence for armed robbery. But thanks to the efforts of his lawyers, even that sentence was significantly reduced, and on December 21, 1944, Galante was free again. During the time he was serving his sentence, his standing in the criminal world grew significantly. He was promoted to captain in the Bonanno family. Unfortunately, it's not known for certain when he was accepted into the family. In 1945, Carmine married Helen Marulli, who later bore him 3 children. This did not prevent him from leaving her for a mistress, who bore him 2 more children. He continued to earn a living by producing counterfeit booze. Sometimes, however, he ran into trouble with the law, but these problems were easily resolved. On September 4, 1947, Galante was caught red-handed dismantling a still that, according to the police, could produce up to 900 gallons of alcohol per day. Carmine was charged with possession of an illegal distillation apparatus and even sent to federal prison, but he managed to quickly regain his freedom thanks to bail. 3 years later, the judge closed the case. Galante also made a living with organized gambling. He usually did this in the company of Joe Beck and his crew. And of course, Galante did not forget his craft as a hired killer, settling matters for the Bonannos. On January 1, 1950, his victim was 24-year-old swindler Dominic Idoni, who had pickpocketed money intended for his superiors. Galante lured Idoni into a meeting, from which he never returned. In 1953, Carmine went to Montreal, Canada, to establish himself in the local drug network. There, Galante worked with Vincenzo Cotroni, the head of the local crime family, and Luis Greco, co-owner of the Bonfire restaurant, which was used as a transit point for drug smuggling. Criminals from the US liked to work in Montreal because the local police were considered one of the most corrupt in North America. In addition, hearings were ongoing in the US before the Kefauver Commission, one of the first large-scale investigations into the activities of organized crime groups. A significant number of criminals from the US moved to Canada to avoid being summoned to court. In December 1954, the Canadian police launched an investigation into the restaurant. They contacted the Immigration Service and requested any records mentioning the name of Galante. The Maine Immigration Office reported that they had no records of Galante's stay in Canada prior to 1954. Canadian law enforcement did not stop there, and by the spring of 1955, their investigation led to the conclusion that the gangsters who had arrived in Montreal from the United States were not just running the Bonfire restaurant, but were using it to sell drugs. In addition, there was a real surge in crime in Montreal. From time to time, shootouts began to take place on the streets, and in the summer of 1955, evidence emerged that American gangsters were trying to impose a tax on virtually all local nightclubs. Those establishments whose owners refused to pay were raided by crowds of gangsters who destroyed everything in sight. Montreal was rapidly turning into Chicago, and the local police had to do something. Since there was no evidence against Galante, Canadian law enforcement decided to focus on his business partner, Luis Greco. A judge issued an arrest warrant for him, and his home was searched, during which weapons and $4,000 were found. On October 10, 1955, Galante was also arrested. He was charged with participating in illegal card games. Yes, it was a minor offense for a gangster of Carmine's caliber, but at that moment, it didn't matter. The police needed any excuse to deport him from the country. Thanks to the intervention of his lawyers, he left Canada only in April 1956. But this did not prevent him from returning several times thereafter. Galante simply stopped asking for permission. The biggest trouble Galante got into in '56 was when he was stopped by traffic enforcement in Broome County, New York, for speeding. He had the documents of his friend Joseph Di Palermo, which Carmine presented to the police. But when they asked him a simple question, "When is your birthday, Mr. Di Palermo?" he had no answer. One of the country's biggest drug dealers was arrested and taken to the police station, where he was searched. Carmine had a pretty big amount of cash on him for 1956, $1,800 At that point, the cops knew they'd caught a big fish. When Galante appeared in court, he pleaded not guilty to both speeding and driving without a license. He was released on $600 bail, and then something strange began to happen. Judge Klausner was inundated with petitions from a huge number of people asking him not to send Carmine Galante to jail. Everyone tried to convince the judge that it would be much better to fine Galante $500. According to the petitioners, the poor town would find a good use for the money. One of the petitioners said that Galante would gladly donate the money to a local orphanage, as the gangster himself had been a very poor child. However, Judge Klausner did not give in, and so on November 9, 1956, Galante appeared before the judge again and was sentenced to 30 days in the Broome County Jail for driving without a license and 2 fines, $100 for speeding and another $50 for using someone else's license. All efforts to keep Carmine out of jail proved futile. On the day of his sentencing in November, Galante was sent to jail, and on December 3rd, he was released. But even during the few weeks Galante spent in jail, high-ranking police officials from New Jersey visited Judge Klausner twice and offered him a bribe to release Carmine. Klausner, however, refused. Around the same time, after returning to the US from a business trip to Canada, Carmine went to Sicily. Galante was interested in people who could be entrusted with running the heroin business in the US, and who were unknown to American police. In his father's hometown of Castellammare del Golfo, Galante managed to recruit many young men who would later be known in the US as Zips due to their speed of work. Almost all of them would become bodyguards, hired killers, or drug dealers. Galante also took part in a meeting organized by the Sicilian Mafia, led by Giuseppe Genco Russo and Gaetano Badalamenti. Essentially, during that meeting, the parties agreed on the routes by which heroin would be transported to the United States. The Sicilians took the responsibility for producing the heroin, which was then sent to Canada and from there to the States, where Galante's Zips distributed it. Upon returning from Italy, Galante narrowly escaped capture by the police. The reason was that during his absence there had been major changes in the criminal world. On October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia was killed. His death raised many questions, which Vito Genovese decided to answer by holding a general meeting in a town called Appalachian on Joe Barbera's estate. This meeting was scheduled for November 14th, but ended without ever beginning. Thanks to the vigilance of local officer Sergeant Edward Croswell, who noticed a gathering of expensive cars near Barbera's estate, a police raid was carried out. The cream of the Italian-American mafia had to flee through the nearby forest. But not everyone managed to escape. Over 50 arrests were made, and among those arrested were such figures as Joseph Bonanno, Joe Profaci, Carlo Gambino, Vito Genovese, and many others. As for Galante, he was one of the few who managed to escape from the meeting. He simply hid in the woods. However, although Galante was never caught, He was named as one of the 60 gangsters who attended the meeting in the November 15, 1957 edition of the New York Daily Mirror. In addition to eyewitness accounts, evidence that Galante was in Appalachian came from the search and interrogation of Salvatore Tornabi of Albany. Although he kept his mouth shut, the police found some very curious notes in his pocket. In one of them, Salvatore simply reminded himself that he had a meeting with Galante, after which he was to call Joseph Barbera in Appalachian. Another note contained the word aquavella. At first, the police thought it was some kind of shaving lotion, but they later learned that the word was very similar to one of Galante's frequently used aliases. Before the RICO Act was passed, the federal government's best weapons against organized crime was tax evasion charges. Galante, who made a fortune from drug trafficking, was constantly thinking about how to legalize his income. In the summer of 1957, he officially became the owner of Rosina Costume Company. Officially, this company was engaged in sewing women's dresses, but the government suspected that the dresses were nothing more than a cover, and in reality the shop was a front for drug trafficking. The feds began to monitor the place. At first, there were no leads. Outwardly, the business was completely legitimate, but they did manage to dig up something. The feds learned that the company often received and sent packages abroad, and did so through the Latimer Shipping Company. This firm was owned by Nick Douganis, better known as Nick the Greek, who lived in Queens and, according to the FBI, was a close associate of Galante. Law enforcement officials also discovered that Douganis and Galante had joint interests in the shipping business, as well as in a loan sharking operation that made money at racetracks. Other sources of income for Galante also came to light. The Star Ledger of Newark published an article stating that Carmine owned a coin-operated machine company, the Abco Vending Company. There's nothing illegal about owning a vending machine company, but journalists discovered that Galante's firm controlled almost the entire coin-op machine market. However, the FBI's attitude toward Galante changed when information finally surfaced that he was involved in a large drug trafficking ring. Galante's name came up at the January hearings of the New Jersey State Law Enforcement Commission. These hearings were public, and from that moment on, the FBI took a firm hold on Carmine. Galante even received a mention from the all-powerful FBI boss, J. Edgar Hoover. He advised his subordinates to pay particular attention to Galante's political connections during the investigation, and to check the legality of income not only of Carmine himself, but also of everyone who worked for him. In essence, the feds launched a full-scale operation to catch Galante. The investigation also took a keen interest in the story of the speeding ticket from 1956 in Broome County. Two circumstances seemed strange to the law officers. Why did so many people get involved in a routine traffic ticket for Galante? And why were the New Jersey cops practically begging their incorruptible colleagues in Broome to take a bribe? In fact, it was only then, in the late 1950s, that the feds realized that Carmine Galante was not just some ordinary thug, but a man with officials, bureaucrats, and police officers on his team. The Galante case was yet another illustration of the corruption that had deeply penetrated both law enforcement and the political and judicial systems. As a result of an internal investigation, a number of police officers were suspended from duty, and one of the so-called couriers who had been offering bribes, Captain Gleitzman, was sentenced to 1 year in prison and a fine of $500. On January 9, 1958, a special federal grand jury conducted its investigation and decided to summon Carmine Galante to testify. Galante was supposed to receive the relevant court summons from a marshal, but he never did. He had disappeared. The home listed in the police file had been sold, and the neighbors unanimously assured the marshal that yes, Galante had once lived there, but had since moved away and no one knew where. In the end, the FBI had to resort to extreme measures and issue posters featuring Galante's photo and a list of his known aliases. Among them was his most famous one, Lilo, a slang Italian word for small, short cigar. Galante was practically never without them. It seemed as if Galante had simply vanished into thin air. The information coming from the informants was varied. Some said that Galante had fled to Italy, while others believed he might be in Miami, as it was easy to get to the Dominican Republic from there. But what business could Carmine have there? It was all down to the laws of the time. U.S. citizens could enter the DR without a passport, and there were no records of entry into the country. Only data was recorded upon departure. It was ideal for someone who had decided to lie low. However, in March 1958, the case took an unexpected turn. Informants reported seeing Galante in Manhattan. FBI agents decided to check the information and hit the jackpot. It turned out that he had booked a hotel room under the name of Carl Acquavella. At that moment, the feds remembered the note they had found among Salvatore Tornabi's belongings. It turned out that Galante had been living a double life all along. He rented an apartment in New Jersey and even lived with a girl named Antoinette. The agents decided to try to get her to talk. They showed her a picture of Carmine Galante and asked if she knew the man. Antoinette turned out to be unexpectedly talkative and not only told the FBI that the man in the photo was her husband, but also confirmed his age and described the car he drove to work at night. At one point, Anne even slipped up and called her husband Carmine. The agents decided to find out more from Antoinette, but she unexpectedly showed up at the next meeting with a lawyer and then left New Jersey altogether. At the same time, the FBI was tapping the phone at Rosina Costume Company. The agents conducting the wiretap noticed that Galante and his compatriots often used the word meatballs. Were they ready? When would they be delivered? Where should they be taken? A memo appeared in Galante's file stating that the individuals could be discussing drug distribution. Agents also noticed that Galante was spending a lot of time in his hotel room. It became clear that he had set something up like a headquarters there. The phone installed there was also tapped, and one of the recorded conversations indicated that something illegal was going on. One of the callers told Galante that he had paid $1 plus 40 on top for the batch, which he wanted to pick up at Bonfire. Apparently, they were talking about a shipment of heroin that had been paid for and was to be picked up at the Montreal restaurant. Galante responded by asking his speaking partner to be careful and make sure that no one was following him when he left. The investigation also worked hard to build cases against Galante's accomplices. On July 3, 1958, the FBI arrested Joseph Di Palermo and charged him with conspiracy to traffic drugs. The court found that he had paid for the trip to Italy in full to a New York taxi driver, Vincent Truppia. In Italy, Truppia was supposed to go to Milan and pick up a package of drugs at a prearranged location. When Truppia fled back to the United States, he was stopped at the airport, and a secret compartment containing 8 kilograms of drugs was found in one of his suitcases. Truppia was in serious trouble. On one hand, he was facing a long prison sentence, and on the other, a bullet from Galante's men. The law enforcement officers made it clear to Vincent that he could ease his fate a little if he began to cooperate with the investigation. Truppia agreed and described in detail the street hideout from which he had taken the drugs. The stash was put under surveillance. It turned out that it was often used by Francesco Perico, who was acquainted with Lucky Luciano. And since at that time, the authorities in both US and Italy were literally obsessed with Luciano. They saw this as confirmation that Lucky was running a heroin smuggling ring. Based on this information, Luciano's apartment was searched, during which the police found a small notebook containing the names of men who were believed to be Luciano's associates involved in smuggling. After that, these men started being arrested. The authorities had even less evidence against Luciano, so he was not charged. He was most likely not involved in such large-scale crime at the end of his life, as we described in detail in the video about Luciano. On April 17, 1959, federal judge Alexander Bix sentenced Vito Genovese to 15 years in prison, calling him one of the largest drug dealers around. On that day, the same judge sentenced Joe Beck to the same term. The feds managed to put several major gangsters behind bars, but the flow of heroin into the US did not slow down. The FBI reported that 2.5 tons of the drug were being imported into the country every year. At the time, this was a huge amount. On June 1, 1959, New Jersey State Police arrested Galante. He was interrogated all night, but he did not give the authorities any information. He slipped into his well-rehearsed role of the ignorant guy. The very next day, Carmine appeared before a judge who charged him with conspiracy to traffic drugs. However, Galante's lawyer argued that his client's case warranted bail. The $100,000 bail was posted that same day, and Galante was once again a free man. However, Galante's problems continued to snowball. In the spring of 1960, he and 29 others were included in another indictment for conspiracy to distribute drugs. Therefore, on May 17, 1960, Galante voluntarily surrendered to the police. However, upon hearing the charges, he, as before, pleaded not guilty and, after paying bail, another 100 grand, he was released again. Carmine appeared in court in November 1960. As eyewitnesses later recalled, the trial was tense, primarily due to the unprecedented pressure on the jury and witnesses. It even got to the point where even the judge learned that a woman who was supposed to testify in the case had been threatened with physical violence. He wanted to revoke Galante's bail. The foreman of the jury was unable to attend the final arguments because he had fallen down a staircase in an abandoned house the day before, breaking his spine and suffering a severe concussion. Galante himself was sentenced to 20 days in prison for contempt of court during the trial after shouting, "Let the jury hear everything." The jury heard everything, and on June 10, 1962, found Galante and 12 co-defendants guilty of conspiracy to violate drug distribution laws. Carmine was sentenced to 20 years in prison, and at the sentence hearing, the judge said, "The evidence presented in court shows that you were the leader, the chief executive officer of this vicious criminal enterprise. You also have a criminal record that demonstrates your complete disregard for the law. You are a threat to public safety." Galante began serving his sentence in the notorious Alcatraz, but he did not stay there long, as the prison was closed in 1963. Carmine was transferred to a federal prison in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. Galante did not have time to get bored in this situation. Among his cellmates were influential union leader Jimmy Hoffa, who had ties to the mafia, and a young John Gotti, who you can see about in a video on our channel. Gotti took a liking to Galante. It's said that Galante even offered the future Teflon Don a job after his release, but he politely declined, saying that he already had a job. On January 24, 1974, Galante was released from federal prison after serving 12 years of a 20-year sentence. Not so great news was awaiting for him on the outside. The government had done everything it could to destroy his heroin supply channels in the US. The system created in Palermo was a thing of the past. Galante needed to find new ways to make money. FBI informants, including Bill Bonanno, son of Joe Bonanno, reported that Galante quickly took control of the family after his release. A paradoxical situation arose. Philip Rastelli, who was then the official boss, ended up behind bars. Galante, who had just been released, was one of the strongest capos in the family and was able to impose his rules on most of the other family members, effectively making him the top man on the streets. It can be said that the Bonanno family experienced another split during this period, albeit not as bloody as in the past, which we described in detail in our video about Joe Bonanno. One of Rastelli's advantages over Galante was that he had been free while Carmine was in prison. Not only did he earn money, but he also gained supporters and friends who wanted him to succeed in the family. In 1965, an FBI report stated that Rastelli was associated with the team of Gaspar di Gregorio, the man who led the rebellion in the Bonanno family, which ultimately led to Joe Bonanno's departure from power. In February 1973, Rastelli was sentenced to 4 years in prison for loan sharking, with an additional 6 months for contempt of court. But around the time Rastelli was preparing to serve his sentence, in the summer of 1973, the boss of the Bonanno family, Natalie Joe Diamond Evola, died. Since Rastelli was popular among the family's capos, he was appointed boss. As for Carmine, after his release, he surrounded himself with his henchmen and set about making up for lost time. He quickly established operations in gambling and loan sharking, but Galante was most preoccupied with revenge. He hated Rastelli, whom the commission had appointed head of the family, as well as Gambino family underboss Aniello Dellacroce, whose men had killed a couple of Galante's heroin dealers. But most of all, Galante hated Frank Costello, who incidentally was already dead by the time Carmine was released. The reason for the hatred is unclear, but when Galante got out of prison, one of his first orders was to blow up Costello's tomb in the cemetery. Cesar Benventre, one of Galante's top men, and a few other guys took some dynamite and headed to St. Michael's Cemetery to do this crazy job. It's hard to say what Galante was hoping to achieve, but the tomb survived. The police report only stated that the doors to the tomb had been torn off and the remains disturbed. Having avenged Costello's remains, in the late winter of 1974, Galante began a campaign to deprive Rastelli of everything he held dear. Rastelli, or Rusty, had a stepson named James Fernand. Rusty adored the boy, and James loved him back. By this point, Fernand was already 41 years old and ran Rastelli's gambling business. Galante ordered him killed, and on March 6, 1974, it was done. Fernand was shot dead in his own clothing store. A year later, in March 1975, Galante further consolidated his position. Philip Rastelli, his nephew Luis, Anthony De Stefano, and Carl Patrol were indicted by a grand jury on racketeering charges. A couple of weeks later, Rusty's nephew Luis was found dead with a .357 caliber Magnum on his knees. The investigation concluded that Luis had committed suicide, but within the family, it was said that it was a murder, ordered by Galante. In just 1 year, Rusty lost several of his closest and most loyal associates. And in the summer of that same year, 1975, he went to prison to serve his 4-year sentence for loan sharking. Rastelli officially continued to run the business from prison, using his family members, his brothers Marty and Carmine, as well as trusted associates such as soldier Joseph Massino. In January 1976, the situation became more complicated for Rastelli. He was brought to trial on charges of extortion in a case that had been initiated a year earlier. A few years prior, Rastelli had created a trade association of food truck operators. After a while, he owned virtually the entire industry, and any operator who refused to join the association and pay huge dues was signing his own death warrant. At best, his hot dog truck would be cooked to the ground. The trial lasted several months, at the end of which, on August 27th, Philip Rastelli had another sentence: 10 years in prison and a $50,000 fine. He served his sentence in Lewisburg, and all contact with his family was limited to 2 people, Joseph Massino and Dominic Napolitano, aka Sonny Black, who was famous for the Donnie Brasco case. Galante, meanwhile, continued to deal with his unfinished business. Even years after his release from prison, he continued to remember all those who had worked for him back when he was sent to Alcatraz. And if anyone betrayed him or tried to take advantage of his absence, Carmine waited for the right moment to take revenge. One such person was Andimo Papadio, a capo in the Lucchese family. Back in the early 1960s, he had common interests with Galante in the garbage business. But when Carmine went to prison, Papadio decided he could take over his gambling business, which he did. On September 25, 1976, Papadio was shot dead near his home in Long Island. His murder remains unsolved. On November 3, 1976, Galante struck another blow against Rastelli's army. He ordered the killing of the family's capo, 70-year-old Pietro Licata. The killer's modus operandi was the same as the Papadio case. Licata was killed near the doorstep of his own home. The newspapers reacted very strongly to these murders. In February 1977, articles appeared in New York publications discussing Galante's growing power, and Time magazine put an end to his colleagues' efforts. It published an article in which Galante was named the boss of bosses of the entire New York Mafia. Years later, one of Bonanno's close associates recalled that this period was indeed a time when Galante's influence was growing. He recruited more and more new members, those who were loyal to him and those who were enemies of Philip Rastelli. Galante felt confident. He even decided to do a good deed for all of New York, which at the time was reeling from the atrocities of serial killer David Berkowitz, also known as the Son of Sam. Galante put a contract out on Berkowitz and made no secret of it. The tabloids reacted to the news with headlines such as "The Mafia Joins the Hunt." In the end, New York City Mayor Abraham Beame was forced to issue a statement politely thanking everyone who had helped in the search of the maniac, but separately noting that the city did not need the mafia's help. The authorities also read the papers and followed the news. Galante was placed under surveillance, and it quickly became clear that he was violating the terms of his parole. One of these rules prohibited him from communicating with convicted criminals, but the feds were able to photograph Galante while he was in the hospital visiting his longtime friend Joe Beck. On August 4th, FBI special agents served Galante with a subpoena for violating the terms of his parole. Carmine appeared in court, but when he stepped before a federal grand jury, he invoked his rights under the Fifth Amendment. The fact is that Galante, given his previous transgressions before the law, had only limited immunity, and therefore the judge ordered him to testify. When Galante refused again, he was charged with contempt of court and arrested. However, he was released the same day on $50,000 bail. On August 24th, Galante returned to federal court, where he again refused to testify. This time, the federal judge informed him that he would remain in custody of federal marshals until he spoke. Carmine realized that this time he would not get off so easily. So he enlisted in the support of some of the best New York lawyers at the time, Roy Cohn and Michael Rosen. They assured the federal judge that their client had fully complied with the terms of his parole, and that all he wanted was work in his daughter's garden on Long Island. The investigation was not satisfied with this answer. It wanted to find out as much as possible about Carmine's relationship with Joe Beck. There were also questions about Galante's other established connections, such as with the Bonanno family captain Alphonse Sonny Red in Delicato, and the king of porn, Mickey Zaffarano. Galante replied that he had never heard of anyone named Joe Beck, and was immediately caught lying. The marshal instantly declared him in violation of his parole, and Galante was returned to prison in Connecticut. There, Galante was placed in solitary confinement. The reason given was that they feared he would attempt murder. From Connecticut, Carmine was transferred to Michigan, and oddly enough, this transfer brought him an unexpected benefit. In Michigan, Carmine befriended a prisoner named Jerry Rosenberg, who was serving a life sentence for murdering 2 people during a robbery. While behind bars, Rosenberg did not waste any time and mangled to earn 2 law degrees. He took it upon himself to study Carmine's case. There were inconsistencies in the case, and on February 27, 1979, a federal judge ordered Galante's release from prison, explaining that he had already served his entire sentence. On March 7th, Lilo was released. Other New York families feared Galante's growing influence. He was too arrogant, trying to subjugate the entire city's drug market. Their request to kill Galante, with Rastelli's approval, was passed on to his protege, 36-year-old Joseph Massino. He had many connections in other New York families. For example, he was a close friend of John Gotti, although Massino became a member of the Bonanno family in 1977. On Galante's recommendation, he feared him because he believed that Galante wanted him dead due to his excessive ambitions. The commission approved the request. The killers studied Galante's daily routine well. They knew that he often visited Joe and Mary's restaurant in Brooklyn. This establishment, owned by Galante's cousin, Giuseppe Turano, served Sicilian cuisine. It was decided that Carmine would be killed there. The hit squad included Anthony Indelicato, Dominic Trinchera, Luis Giangetti, and Russell Morrow. The main role in the assassination was signed to Indelicato, who already had several murders to his name. Massino also insisted on participating in the assassination and was given a place in the getaway car, along with Anthony Indelicato's father, Sonny Red. They were supposed to monitor the hit, and if the first 4 men failed, to finish the job. At noon on July 12, 1979, Carmine Galante arrived at the restaurant with his nephew James. James Galante worked as a driver for his uncle, and after waiting for him to enter the restaurant, he drove away. Galante did not come to the restaurant just for lunch that day. Turano was planning to go on a vacation to Sicily the next day, so lunch was much more festive than usual. A few minutes later, 3 more men arrived at the restaurant. They were drug dealer Leonard Coppola and 2 Zips, Galante's bodyguards, Baldassare Amato and Cesar Bonventre. Galante's relatives had never liked Coppola. They knew very well how he earned his living. But Carmine reassured everyone, insisting to everyone that he was his friend. The men sat on the open terrace, which could only be accessed by walking through the entire restaurant. Lunch lasted quite a long time, over 2 hours. At 2:45 p.m., a sedan pulled up to the restaurant and 4 men got out, their faces hidden by ski masks. 3 of them entered the restaurant, while the 4th, Santo Giordano's driver, remained at the entrance with a rifle in his hands. The first to notice the uninvited guests was the restaurant owner's son, John Turano. He managed to shout and a few seconds later was shot by Dominic Trinchera. Hearing the shots, the restaurant employees began to hide. Then, the 3 killers went out onto the terrace. Bruno Indelicato dealt with the owner of the restaurant, Giuseppe Turano. Galante was lighting a cigar when Russell Mauro shot him in the chest with a shotgun. The shot was so powerful that it knocked him onto his back. His death was instantaneous. The most unusual behavior during the assassination was that of Galante's bodyguards, Bonventre and Amato. Instead of protecting the man whose life they were supposed to guard, they joined the team of killers. Cesar Bonventre first shot Coppola when he fired 2 shots at the dead body of his former boss. Either the bodyguards knew about the upcoming hit and were involved in it, or they quickly assessed the situation and chose the right side, saving their lives. Just as quickly as they appeared, the men retreated through the restaurant and went out into the street. The bodyguards went out with them and drove away in one car. Soon, police arrived at the scene, along with the ubiquitous journalists. They saw Carmine "Cigar" Galante's body with a cigar in his mouth. When Galante's corpse was carried out into the street to be loaded into a police hearse, a man ran up to it and spat on it. A journalist who was present was surprised and asked why he did it. The man replied that he had fought against fascism during the war and that Carlo Tresca had been his friend. The Roman Catholic Church refused to hold a funeral mass for Galante. He was buried in St. John's Cemetery in Queens. An impressive crowd gathered at the cemetery. Not far from Galante's grave are the graves of Lucky Luciano, Joe Profassi, Joseph Colombo, Carlo Gambino, John Gotti, Vito Genovese, and many others. Some journalists managed to get into Galante's funeral and asked those present who they thought was responsible for his death. Almost everyone said that Galante was the victim of an accident or robbery committed by some Puerto Ricans. Most of those who participated in Galante's murder survived him by only a couple of years. For example, on May 5, 1981, Dominic Trinchera was killed on Massino's orders. However, there were also those who benefited from Galante's murder. Napolitano and Massano instantly rose from soldiers to capos. The story of Napolitano is familiar to all viewers of our channel. 2 years later, he would be killed for bringing FBI agent Joseph D. Pistoni into the family. As for Cesar Bonventre, he was soon arrested by the feds. Bonventre denied knowing anything about the assassination attempt and was therefore released without charge. However, this betrayal did not bring him any dividends. While Rastelli was in prison, his capos began planning a coup within the family. Bonventre decided that it would be better for him to side with the current boss in the coming war, but he failed to take one thing into account. Unlike Galante, Rastelli pathologically distrusts Zips, and Joseph Massino did not like him either. Bonventre made several attempts to get closer to Massino, but on April 1984, he was killed. A soldier from the Bonanno family, Sal Vitali, took part in his murder. In 2010, Vitali began cooperating with the investigation and revealed, among other things, the murder of the Zip. Such was the life of Carmine Galante. He spent his entire life striving for power, almost achieved it, but at the last moment the door closed right in front of him. Some may believe that if he had become the boss of the family, his reign would have been similar to the reckless reign of John Gotti or Nicky Scarfo. Some may believe that the family would have prospered, but one thing is certain. With Galante's death, an entire era came to an end, and he was the quintessential face of it all.